So, first I will call Professor Chen, Peter Chen, to speak. Professor Peter Chen is head of the Laboratory of Organic Chemistry at the famous ETH Zurich, the famous Polytechnic of Zurich. In his CV, he says he's an ABC, which means an Asian-born, an American-born Chinese. Yes, an American-born Chinese. And he puts that in the slide of his VC as first thing. And I think this is very interesting because he will talk to us about a European experience, but he comes from America. And I think we have a lot to learn by seeing how the various cultures and systems compare. He was an assistant and associate professor at Harvard University, and then since 1988 he's been a professor at ETH Zurich. He was also for a couple of years vice president for research and corporate relations at the ETH, and he's a board member of Clariant, which is one of the leading specialty chemical companies in the world. And he's an executive board member in the Swiss National Science Foundation. So he brings a variety of cultures and a variety of professional backgrounds to this session, and we look forward to listening to him.
Thank you, Mr. Doxiotis, for the introduction, and I'd also like to join the other speakers in thanking the organizers for the chance to address this meeting. The CV is a short form. There's many other things I do, and actually this is a very characteristic feature of the Swiss system, is that all of us wear many hats, and this leads to a very intensive networking and interconnection among all the people, which is one of the reasons that the system works efficiently. Now, this morning in the presentation from Professor Kritikos, he showed a slide on the innovation scorecard versus the business climate for different countries. And I think there were two things that I saw there which I would want to mention and to start my talk with. First of all, in the innovation scorecard, Switzerland ranked number 1 in the world, according to the criteria that was done by the European Commission. The second thing is there is a trend line where if you look at the innovation scorecards ranking and the business environment, and you see that, if you recall the slide from this morning, that Switzerland not only ranked high, but it was well off the line. It was an outlier. And that's an important thing to notice, because in another case I want to show you something similar, and this is why I presume I was invited here today. This is a slide which we had prepared, at least our staff had prepared some years ago. It takes data from Nature in 2004. It looks at the citation of all papers from within a certain country, normalized according to the GDP. Because, of course, it's no surprise that a richer country has a higher research output than a poorer country. Nobody would expect otherwise. But what you should notice is that if it was only about money, and nothing else, then if you plotted research output normalized by GDP against GDP, you should have a flat line. And in fact, most countries in the world it's not a flat line. There are other factors besides wealth. It's this line that slopes up, but you see up at the top, the circle's point, which shows Switzerland again. Again, it is a country that lies off of the trend line. We perform better in R&D, and we perform better in innovation than we should according to the metrics that we show. And that means it's not only about money, it is also about the system, the incentives, how you get people to take the risks, how you get the people to come, how do you get the people to work. This is all the important factor. Now, Switzerland and Greece are both within Europe. Other than that, they're both small countries. I was asked to come here because I guess it was Benedikt Herrmann had heard me speak before, and there was a comment that I'd made, and that is something which sparked this invitation. That is, we want to look at what the success factors are. When did Switzerland take off? I mean, everyone's used to the notion that Switzerland is a rich country, one of the richest in the world. But if you go back, let's say, to the middle of the 19th century or a little bit before, so 150 years or more, it's a surprise to most people that Switzerland was the poorest country per capita in Central and Western Europe. It was well behind England, France, and Germany. In fact, there's a number of studies which show, for example, that if you adjusted the income relative to the purchasing power parity, that, for example, Swiss incomes were less than a third of what they were in England in the first half of the 19th century. Switzerland was largely an agricultural country. Its major exports were cheese and young men who went to fight in other people's armies. And so from that starting point, a country with essentially no natural resources except for water and some very attractive mountains, Switzerland has developed into one of the richest countries in the world, and that in the period of about 150 years. And I think this is a story which is important to tell. The databases, by the way, for judging relative wealth and things like that going back to 1800 is poor. But if you look at a number of studies, and there's quite a few which have looked at it, you can say that the Swiss economy took off in the last decades of the 19th century. And that from this position well behind the pack in Europe, it achieved parity with England by about the beginning of the First World War, and then surpassed the rest of Europe after that. Having stayed out of the wars, of course, but already catching up with the rest of Europe by the beginning of the 20th century, I think was a great achievement. What you see here are statistics showing the primary sector, which is agricultural employment, dropping from 1850 to 1990. Secondary sector is manufacturing, that's the red line, and the tertiary sector, which is service, is the blue line. And Switzerland today, by the way, you would not expect, when you look at all the mountainsides and the beautiful lakes and the hills and things, that it is one of the most industrialized countries in the world, with a fraction of manufacturing in the GDP of about 20%, which is higher than Germany's, a little bit higher than Germany's. But it is a case where the manufacturing is very prominent. The service sector is mostly the finance industry. But in any case, it is a manufacturing economy which is very different from the German one in that it has no large-scale commodity manufacturing. We don't make cars, we don't make methanol, we don't make petrochemicals. We specialize in high-value, low-volume products that we sell for a high price, and that compensates, for example, for high standard of living and high labor costs in Switzerland. It is a very decisive choice. This is how we maintain the standard of living despite the high cost basis. In the 20th century, if we look at development GDP, you see Switzerland, the red line, outpacing England, France, and Germany. There's a bit of a convergence toward the end because the Swiss economy is so tightly coupled into the European Union. And the question is now, how do we achieve this? Okay? This was a paper that came from a group that was at the United Nations University, and they looked exactly at the question that I just posed. 200 years ago, Switzerland was desperately poor. The takeoff was at the end of the 19th century. A number of studies all agree upon that. What are the success factors? And here you see in the summary from the paper a list of success factors. We note that openness towards foreign markets and early internationalization of companies led to a high degree of competition with positive effects on innovation, productivity, and flexibility. It says, we suggest that a high level of competition in goods and labor markets combined with a political system that ensured contestability provided the basis for stability and prosperity of Switzerland. A number of words about open labor markets. Now, this is a very short talk I have, so rather than trying to get the broad brush, I want to now focus down drastically and show a case study of how open labor markets and a very different view of how we get people to put out more than we expect, actually produce above average results. I'm going to talk about the ETH. The ETH was founded in 1855. It is the first, and for more than 100 years, the only federal university in Switzerland. The other universities, University of Basel, Zurich, these are all cantonal, funded locally. The ETH, founded in 1855, was the first federal university. And until the EPFL, which was founded in 1975, it was the only one. Now, it is a science and technology university. It's a polytechnic, which has become a technical university. We don't have humanities, social sciences, things like that. And you see here the first 6 departments. Chemistry, my institute, was one of the original 6 institutes in the ETH. And the question is, how did we achieve international prominence at a time of the founding when at the time of the founding we were on the edge of the German-speaking world? We had no reputation, relatively limited funds, no great prospects to compete against Heidelberg and Berlin and places like that. How did we do it? Okay. So, it all has to do about people. We've seen this many, many times today. It all has to do with who you get and what you let them do. So, we had bold appointment politics and early emphasis on research. In my institute, here are the professors appointed before 1900. So during the phase when Switzerland took off, and during the phase where the ETH was building its reputation. Remember, we were a nowhere address. And although the pictures show a bunch of old men, you should make a note that they were all very young men when they became full professor. That is the age at which they became head of the institute. Not an assistant professor, not an Oberassistent, but when they became the head of the institute and assumed the ability to make decisions. We recruited them from outside. From this list of professors from before 1900, one of them, Robert Genehm, is Swiss. One of them, Frederick Treadwell, is American. All the rest are German. We had a very, very, very high fraction of foreign faculty in the beginning because there was no Swiss output to recruit from. And we took the best young talent because no established research would come to Switzerland. You see the same tactic in Singapore, in KAUST, and other universities that have been newly founded. You recruit young people. But what we did is we not only recruited them, but we made them the leaders at a very young age. Arthur Hansch was made institute head at age 28. He was a Privatdozent in Leipzig, and the president of the ETH went to Leipzig personally to offer him the position, to come and head the whole institute in Zurich. You also will note that they didn't stay in Zurich very long. They left. As soon as they got famous, they went somewhere else, to Tübingen, to Heidelberg, to the traditional places in Germany. That is not bad. This is the circulation of talent that we heard about earlier, and it allows us to continuously recruit young talent. But the quality of the recruiting is very important. Robert Genehm eventually became the president of the ETH in the beginning of the 20th century, and he had a very good eye for talent. He recruited 4 Nobel Prize laureates in his term as president, but he recruited them before they had the prize. We also recruited women. In 1878, we had the first women graduate. They were admitted on equal standing with men, and so we took advantage of that part of the labor pool. And we were emphasizing research from a very early time. This is the first PhD offered by the ETH. It was from my institute in chemistry in 1901. The last part is that, of course, the people are important, but it's also important that they have a vision. And this vision has to come from the very bright people. It makes no sense if you bring the smartest people from the worldwide market to you and then don't let them do what they want. We have the case here of Leopold Ruciska. He became professor in 1940. He also received later a Nobel Prize. He is the first professor in my institute who actually stayed until retirement. So from 1855 to 1940, no professor in my institute stayed until retirement. But by 1940, the ETH had achieved sufficient reputation and resources to retain its talent. That's a very interesting message. It took nearly a century. And Ruciska was the one who created the Modern Institute. He recognized, this is a 1955 retrospective, that chemistry required further integration of physics and biology. He founded the Laboratory for Physical Chemistry and the Institute for Biochemistry, by the way, with industrial money. And this interdisciplinary vision that he had was 30 years before his time. And he didn't have to ask a government ministry for permission to do the interdisciplinary work. He went and got the money from industry, and they founded an institute of biochemistry before anybody had that on their radar screen. This is vision. By the way, we're embarrassed to ask companies for a few $100,000 today. But Ruciska went to SIBA and asked for a building, 2 professorships, and all the assistants, and they gave it to him. The second visionary personality in this row is Vlado Prelog, and I show him because there's another interesting principle here that I want to emphasize. He also received the Nobel Prize later, but in 1957, after Ruciska's retirement, he became the institute head. And what he did is he split his chair into 7 chairs, one of which I have. And the reason was because he realized for the first time in the Institute, we had Swiss candidates that we wanted to hire, Eschenmoser and Aragoni, and there was no position. They were both offered positions at Harvard University, and Prelog said, what do we need to do to keep them? And the answer was, you can't take a top person and offer them a position which is inherently subordinate. Good people do not come to become an assistant to somebody else, especially somebody who's not maybe as good as they are. If you want to recruit good people, you have to let them do what they want to do. And so what Prelog did, he was king, and he split his kingdom into 7 dukedoms and gave them away. And that created the modern institute today. And this College of Equals is a very strong point. If you bring in young people, very, very smart people, let them do what they want. Just like in the 19th century, we gave the institute to young people, now the professorship should go to younger ones as well. This is our current institute today. 1 assistant professor, Petra Dietrich, and the 7 full professors. You can see, again, it is fully international. 1 Swiss, 3 Americans, a Luxembourger, and 2 Germans. Of the 4 Americans, 3 of us have been naturalized as Swiss subsequently, but we recruit worldwide, and you can see where we recruit from. We are one of the very few places in Europe which can raid the top American universities and move the people here. This is important. I can tell you why we did it. So, I was also asked in this talk to talk a little bit about technology transfer. We have an excellent academic reputation, but because we allow the professors to run the place, and we allow the professors to interact freely with the private sector, we have very vigorous technology transfer. So, the first thing I want to say is technology transfer happens primarily in the heads of our graduates. Startup companies, and I'll talk a bit about those in a few minutes, are fine, but they do not create that many jobs, and they do not save an economy. They have another purpose. The larger economy is largely fueled by our graduates, and one of the things that we're very proud of is nearly 1/3 of the business leaders in Switzerland got their education at ETH, and we train scientists and engineers. Most of our business leaders are not finance guys or lawyers, they are scientists and engineers, and that is a very important thing to recognize. The individual professors have extensive contacts with industry. We are signing typically 500 to 600 collaboration contracts per year with only 400 professors. This is important because we do not tax them, we do not punish them, we do not scold them for working with companies. The companies that we deal with are worldwide, not just Swiss. Companies from all over the world, the United States, Europe, Asia, we have all of these collaborations. And when these get far enough, we can get a large deal to bring them home. As vice president, I negotiated a deal in 2008 where IBM built a joint laboratory with ETH in Zurich. They spent $60 million to build a building, and we rent it from them, and as rent we pay the depreciation. They put the CapEx up, we put the OpEx. And the research is 50-50 funded, unique IP sharing arrangement. This is the kind of deal you want to make. Subsequently, we made a deal with Disney and brought Disney to Zurich as well, and Google as well. And so this kind of public-private partnership, this was the first one in Europe, are the kind of deals we can make because of the contacts that our professors have. I did mention that our startups and spin-offs, between 1998 and 2008, we had 153 spin-offs. And I picked this time frame because as vice president, I put in a study, I commissioned a study at the London Business School to look at these startups. And you see that 90% survived 5 years. They generated 170 million francs in equity raised. And their IRR, for those of you in the VC business, if they were a portfolio in which we held equity, which unfortunately we did not, their IRR was 43%. Between 1998 and 2008, and that was a very, very hard decade after the dot-com bust. And so this shows the quality of the startups that come out of a faculty which is allowed to do what it wants. Don't punish them. Don't punish smart people. Okay? So that is the message I want to give you. You can take a small country, you can become internationally competitive, but what you have to do is you bring in the people and let them do what they want. Build a culture which rewards performance and lets them make decisions on their own. The last thing people want is to be told what to do.